Last night, the moon was so bright, it melted the walls away. And it wasn't alarming when I saw Prince Charming come into my bedroom and say,
let me persuade you to come to the place where tomorrow meets today.
ooh!
Bigger and better cities and gadgets. Forward progress. If you were a scientist, you were in.
Your excellent science, I am your faithful servant.
That's tomorrow.
Building a new world.
When did all this begin, Dad?
Well, son, it's a very old story. It's so old it's hard to say when it really began. Could have been back in 1540 when Copernicus identified the Earth as a speck of dust moving in an orbit around the sun. Or it could have been in 1905 when a young German physicist arrived at a fundamental truth, that matter could be converted into energy and expressed it in the equation E equals mc squared. Then there were other dates. 1937, the first industrial atom smasher. 1942, the first nuclear chain reaction. 1945, the bomb. Somewhere in the course of these events, the dawn came up on the atomic era. It's going to have a tremendous effect on our town down there, son. It'll be felt in every town in America. And it won't matter if they make ships or shoes or sealing wax. With atomic power will come benefits to mankind that we can as yet only imagine.
In 1945, in the aftermath of war, scientists were heroes, particularly the physicists who had built the atomic bomb. They are men, said Life magazine, who wear the tunic of Superman and stand in the spotlight of 1,000 suns. In the public imagination, atomic scientists had harnessed a terrifying power which could literally reshape the world.
We knew the world would not be the same. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
Many of the scientists who had worked on the atomic bomb felt a deep sense of guilt about what they had done. They were convinced they now had a moral duty to use the immense forces they had unleashed to better, peaceful purposes. What they did not foresee were the demands that would be made on them when their science came out of the laboratory and into the world of politics and big business. They would lose control and be forced to compromise and to deceive.
So all of a sudden we found that as scientists and technologists, we were capable of changing in a massive way the framework in which society functioned. I and many others felt that nuclear power represented a major energy future for the world. You have to understand that this was the first time that mankind had ever found an energy source which wasn't a routine natural phenomenon. Fire, of course, comes every time a lightning strikes a forest. Nuclear power was something else completely. We made it. And our ability to give the world what appeared to be, and still does appear to be, a limitless energy source for the future was, to any scientist and engineer, probably the most exciting philosophic concept you could find.
Many people thought that science was the principal war winner, that science was the perfectly marvelous thing which could tackle anything, provided you got the right brain power on it and had unlimited resources and the political will to do it. I really thought, at long last, we could surge ahead into a new world.
Yes, we were a very proud and elated bunch of technocrats. over this long line of gray cars, now extending nearly 10 miles back from the border.
The nuclear scientists were not alone in their ambitions. In the late 40s, there was a growing belief that scientific methods could be used to solve social problems. This sometimes took extreme forms. In America, an organization founded in the 30s, Technocracy, Inc., flourished. The technocrats dressed in grey uniforms and drove grey cars. They called for a new society governed on a rational basis.
Technocracy means science applied to the social system, to the entire structure of society. Politics would cease to exist, and the people who would be in authority would be scientists and engineers. Knowledge would lead to control.
There was one other country in the world as bewitched as America by the power of science.
Those were days when there was a tremendous urge for knowledge. Moscow became more beautiful.
The inauguration of first-year students. Your excellent science, I am your faithful servant. I bow before you. Be condescending to me.
But this popular belief that the methods of science could be applied to society was based on a curiously out-of-date notion of how the universe worked. It was that the world was just an enormous, complicated machine which would become predictable and controllable if only you knew enough about it. Yet this idea had been undermined in the years before the war by the very scientists who had first unlocked the power of the atom. They had found that the closer they peered into the structure of the world, the more complex and unpredictable it became.
Today, at Shippingport, Pennsylvania, we began building our first atomic power plant of commercial size. Mankind comes closer to fulfillment of the ancient dream of a new and a better Earth. The scientists have provided us with an example of nuclear science at work. In this baton, there is a small source of neutrons. I bring this source of neutrons over to this place in which we have uranium, and we set up a bit of atomic fission. This will move the marker on the scale and finally light the light, and the project will be started.
The President of the United States has just started off electronically the groundbreaking power shovel 1,400 miles away in Shippingport, Pennsylvania.
In this general mood of enthusiasm for science, politicians began to look to atomic power as more than just cheap electricity. It became the way to a better world.
Это были годы больших надежд. Только что умер Сталин, пришел к власти Хрущев, и атомная энергия рассматривалась как средство для достижения лучшего уровня благосостояния народа. Тем более, что мы все тогда были загипнотизированы ленинским лозунгом. У Ленина есть такой лозунг. Коммунизм – это значит советская власть плюс электрификация всей страны. Вот электрификация – это атомная энергия, плюс советская власть, и значит коммунизм.
At the very same time as Eisenhower began construction at Shippingport, Russia suddenly announced it had already built the world's first nuclear power station. What the Soviets did not reveal was that it took more electricity to run the plant than it produced. Then in 1956, another country entered the nuclear race. In this case, the atom's role was to recapture the glories of the past.
Tomorrow, Her Majesty the Queen, here at Calder Hall in Cumberland, is to open the first nuclear power station in the world to operate on an industrial scale.
Our prosperity in the Victorian era, wrote the government's scientific advisor Lord Cherwell, was due to the men who put Britain 80 years ahead in the use of steam power. Our prosperity in the coming century will depend on learning how to exploit the latent energy in uranium.
Uranium. Well, now that is uranium. That little black thing I'm holding in my hand, 2 pounds of that size of uranium. And the potential energy which could be given off by this when properly used is equal to the energy, or the heat if you like the word better, produced by 2,600 tons of coal. That is uranium.
Atomic scientists, by a series of brilliant discoveries, have brought us to the threshold of a new age. It is with pride that I now open Calder Hall, Britain's first atomic power station.
The British government announced that by 1965, half the country's electricity would come from nuclear power.
Now, Dr. Leslie, we, see, it seems to me, in the building of this great place and its operation, have actually got ahead of the Russians and of the Americans.
Yes, the atom is on its way to brighten our towns and to help manufacture our most dependable and indispensable household servant.
In the late 50s, the Atomic Energy Commission made films that portrayed an atomic future in America. Scientists designed nuclear cars, planes, and rockets. Others predicted whole new cities powered by vast atomic engines. If somehow a product could be atomic, it had to be good.
Which are now being developed with atomic energy. Even your toothpaste may be a product of the atomic age. Home from a trip? You may have been carrying an atomic suitcase.
To those of us working in the field, this was an idyllic situation. We were socially acceptable. Everybody in the community thought we were heroes. Everything we did was exciting to them. And it was exciting to us because we were at the frontier of doing new things all the time. And there was nothing to stop us. To a scientist or an engineer involved in this was a heaven.
At this experimental farm, the peanuts, being so carefully classified and tagged, were grown from seeds radiated in atomic reactors. These are giants created by radiation. We can imagine their future impact on the peanut-buying public. And in a free country, with a free enterprise economy, there are no bounds to what man's creative ingenuity can accomplish.
The most extraordinary idea of all was Project Plowshare. Nuclear explosions would be used to reshape and transform large areas of the world. The scientist behind it was Edward Teller, the man who had created the H-bomb.
The peaceful use of nuclear explosives. Now the problem was how to do that, not hurting people by the explosion. Easy, they shouldn't be there. But radioactivity would be released. That radioactivity to the public had to be minimized. That was not so easy, but it could be done. The purposes: change the geography, dig the kind of canal that otherwise would be too expensive to dig, a sea level canal between the Atlantic and the Pacific, create a harbor in North Australia where there are big iron deposits and very few people. It could have been done. And I believe that when we get over nuclear hysteria, someday it will be done.
Да, я считаю, что, в общем, это был золотой век физики. И вообще появление энтузиазма у ученых, у специалистов, что они многое могут. Вот, что у них какие-то большие возможности появляются.
Science for the world. A dynamic world moving rapidly, flying, reacting to flashes on the radar screen, watching schedules where everything is calculated down to seconds and fractions of seconds. Science has permeated our very existence and can no longer detach itself.
The station is to be situated on the shores of a forest lake. During the rest period, a magic silence reigns around the building site.
But now, just when the scientists were being swept along on a wave of publicity, they began to discover it was going to be far more difficult to produce nuclear power than they had first thought. The problem was the cost of building the reactors. They were proving too expensive to compete with conventional fuels. In the Soviet Union, this led to increasing pressure to build fast, often without proper protection from nuclear radiation. In February 1957, the planner in charge of the whole nuclear power program died from an accidental burst of radioactivity.
Давили на нас, конечно, экономические факторы. Желание сделать подешевле, подоступнее эту энергетику, эту энергию. Ну, естественно, хотя мы понимали, что надо делать станцию безопасно и так далее, но все-таки экономика, она очень сильно владела нашим сознанием. Они настолько быстро двигались, что кое-что не успели просто еще сделать. И поэтому, может быть, мы недостаточно уделяли внимание рассмотрению вопросов обеспечения безопасности, в особенности в части тяжелых аварий.
Then, in October 1957, there was a major accident in Britain. The core of the reactor caught fire and spewed high levels of radioactivity across northwest England. The radioactivity released was far worse than the public was told. It led some scientists to question the speed at which the technology was being pushed to compete with fossil fuels. They included the scientist who had built Windscale, Christopher Hinton. He had been put in charge of implementing the government's plans for cheap electricity.
Hinton was a thoroughly honest man, and when he found that all sorts of bogus tales had been told about the relative costs of electricity from nuclear energy, he was shocked. He told me this, that he was absolutely shocked. He realized that the estimates of the cost of nuclear energy compared with the cost of coal energy were cooked. And when I said to him, why didn't you do anything about it, he said, well, I couldn't, because the thing had gone too far. You see, so much had been committed then to a nuclear future.
No more shillings for the gas. Mother just splits an atom and supper's ready.
It must have been some billions that they'd already spent. It was too late.
It is, of course, a cliche that we're living at a time of such rapid scientific change that our children are accepting as part of their everyday life things which would have been dismissed as science fiction a few years ago. We're living perhaps in a more rapid revolution than some of us realize.
The politicians were now committed to nuclear power. In 1960, a Labour politician, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, suggested an idea for a party political broadcast. To the hymn Jerusalem, the camera would rise from waving fields of corn to reveal an atomic plant.
The conscious, planned, purposive use of scientific progress to provide undreamed of living standards and the possibility of leisure, ultimately, on an unbelievable scale.
Nuclear scientists were now being carried along by a political enthusiasm for what science could achieve. Yet few of them in Britain, America, or the Soviet Union knew how to fulfill the promises they had made.
There's a new dawn breaking over our world. The hopeful dawn of the atomic era. What benefits it will
But two large American corporations, Westinghouse and General Electric, had already invested millions of dollars in nuclear technology. For them, there was no way back. In 1961, the new chief executive of General Electric told his staff, we're going to ram this nuclear thing through.
We can move forward to new and even greater achievements in the atomic era. This is the hope that awaits us in this new dawn's early light.
Control over nuclear technology had passed from the scientists to the industrialists. They were now about to take an enormous gamble to make nuclear power not only practical, but profitable.
I'm Bert Wolf. I had General Electric's Peaceful Nuclear Power Program. And this is a building which is made to model an actual boiling water reactor. we can come right over here to a facility where down low in the cavity there is the boiling water reactor.
General Electric and Westinghouse took the simplest form of nuclear reactor, originally designed for submarines, and redesigned it on a gigantic scale. These were then offered to power companies at knockdown prices. The manufacturers decided to bear any extra costs themselves. They gambled they could start a bandwagon, which would make the nuclear business profitable. The key figure was the salesman.
We would sell one at a time, and each time we sold one, we'd have a celebration. I can recall when we'd have meetings and someone would come in and said, we sold a plant to somebody, and we'd all stand up and shake hands and go out for lunch and have wine and toast each other. It was a great celebration. Then in the late 60s, we began selling these by the tens, so it became a real business.
The plants were sold often before they had even been designed. The power company accepted on faith the manufacturer's claims that because the reactors were big, they would achieve economies of scale. These sales were then cited to the next buyer as proof of the soundness of the manufacturer's claims. In the process, the reactors became bigger and bigger. And it worked. The two corporations sold dozens of plants at home and abroad. Only Britain refused to succumb.
A giant of limitless power at man's command. Man is building a brighter future for his children and his children's children in the new world of the atomic age.
But senior nuclear scientists were worried about safety in these enormous plants. At the center of the reactor was the uranium core. Its heat powered the generators. The cores were now so large that if for any reason the flow of water to keep them cool were lost, they would melt. The scientists feared that such a core could then burn its way through the floor of the containment shell. In theory, there would be nothing to stop it emerging on the other side of the world. They called it the China syndrome. The doubters included Alvin Weinberg, the man who had designed the original submarine reactor.
As long as the reactor was as small as the submarine intermediate reactor, which was only 60 megawatts, then the containment shell was absolute. Now that's not quite right because...
When you say the containment shell was absolute, do you mean it was safe?
It was safe. But when you went to 600 megawatt reactors and 1,000 megawatt reactors, you could not guarantee this because you could, in some very remote situation, conceive of the containment being breached by this molten mass. And that change, I would assert, occurred as a result of this enormous economic pressure to make the reactors as large as possible.
In 1964, a team of scientists working for the Atomic Energy Commission studied the possible consequences of a nuclear accident. They concluded, "We have found in our present study nothing inherent in reactors or in safeguard systems as they now have been developed, which guarantees either that major reactor accidents will not occur or that protective safeguard systems will not fail. Should such accidents occur, very large damages could result."
And that's when the nuclear